Thank you, everybody. This is essentially part two of our look at bias crimes and hate crimes in Oregon, and what we can do to support those people who are survivors of bias and hate crimes. Last week we had Johanna Costa with us talking about the different supports and avenues that are available for people who are reporting bias crimes, the way we track those, and the way they are supported through that process. Today, we are lucky to be joined by BJ Park, the Deputy District Attorney from Multnomah County. And, as we're doing work within community justice around equity and around our commitment to diversity and inclusion, the one thing that it continues to bring home is that it's not just a switch. It's not one piece. It's comprehensive. It's pervasive. And I think the same is for our criminal justice system. When we look at the justice outcomes we want for folks, equity really is in so many different places, in all places really. And as we look at the way these crimes are prosecuted to create a more equitable and safe Oregon, BJ, I just want to thank you again for joining us and turn the floor over to you. So thank you.
Thank you so much for having me. Let me get share the screen for the PowerPoint that I have. I'm BJ Park. I'm a Deputy District Attorney here in Multnomah County. I actually started off I've been a prosecutor now for about 24 years, amazingly. And I started off as a prosecutor in the very peaceful city of Chicago. That's where I'm originally from, for 15 years. And then I came to Oregon and was at Oregon DOJ for 5 years. And then I've been here now for about 3.5 years. So my specializations include, lots of violent crimes, from homicides to stabbings and shootings and beatings and all that stuff, Measure 11 stuff, to ICAT crimes, the child pornography, the online enticement and victimization of children, as well as sex crimes, both adult and children victims, and now this as well. I just wanted to go over the statute itself, because I think that's what will answer a lot of the questions. And there's been a new law that came into being not last year, but the year before, so 2019, July. And even though it's been a year and a half, it's really important to understand both the old law and the new law. And people may wonder, well, why do I have to know about the old law when it's not here anymore? Well, because there's still cases that the statute of limitations is not run on those. And the old law still is very similar to the new law, so it would still be relevant enough. So I've tried to break it down pretty simply. So here we go. So this is the old law, which is ORS 166.165. It's formally called Intimidation in the First Degree, or as I call it here, Intimidation 1. It was a felony, and it was simply this. So the old law had 3 different possible ways to commit this offense. The first is this: 2 or more defendants acting together, and that applies to all 3 ways. And here's the first way to commit it. 2 or more defendants acting together, intentionally, knowingly, or recklessly cause physical injury to victim. So that sounds like assault 4, but you have to have 2 or more defendants acting together because of defendant's perception of victims' race, color, religion, sexual orientation, disability, or national origin. So that's what I call the protected class of the victim. So that was the 3 elements of the first way to commit Intimidation 1. Second way to commit it, and please notice the or, so it doesn't have to be both. So the second way to commit it is 2 or more defendants acting together with criminal negligence cause physical injury to the victim by means of a deadly weapon because of defendant's perception of victims, so on and so on and so on. Okay. And here is the third way to commit it, which is 2 or more defendants acting together intentionally place victim in fear of imminent serious physical injury, menacing essentially, because of defendants, and then so on and so on. So these were the 3 possible ways to commit Intimidation 1 under the old laws. There was a intimidation second, or intimidation in the second degree, Intimidation 2, which was ORS 166.155, and that was a misdemeanor, Class A misdemeanor, And there were three possible ways to commit this offense as well. The first is tampers or interferes with property, having no right to do so or no reasonable grounds to believe that the defendant has such right, with the intent to cause substantial inconvenience to victims. This is essentially criminal mischief. Because of, and it's the same, everything else is the same here, because of defendant's perception of victims, one of these protected class, as I call it. The second way to commit intimidation to, under the old law, is intentionally subjects victim to offensive physical contact, which is essentially harassment, because of victim's defendant's perception and so on. Okay, so that the rest is the same. The third possible way to commit it is a little bit different than the menacing statute, which is intentionally subjects victim to alarm by threatening one of these two things: A, to inflict serious physical injury or commit a felony affecting the victim or a member of victim's family, so it extends to victim's family member, or B, to cause substantial damage to the property of victim or victim's family because of, and then so on and so on and so on. So that were the three possible ways to commit the old intimidation to a misdemeanor. So the issue came up where I actually, since it just got changed a year and a half ago, and I've been here 3.5 years, we were prosecuting quite a bit of these cases. A lot of people think, oh, Multnomah County progressive, oh, it must be like, there must be no such hate crimes. It's quite the opposite, actually. Our unit handles them. It's not just me. I just happen to do a lot of them for whatever reason. It's kind of a snowball effect, I think. It's hard to quantify, but I would say roughly, being conservative, I'd probably get about 2 of these cases a month on average. Sometimes you get none, sometimes you get a lot more. And that's just me. Our unit, which is the violent crimes unit, has 5 other people who handle these types of cases. They probably have a little less, but they still handle these, and they still have these kind of cases. So it's not just me. As I said, I have the most, and I get roughly, don't quote me on it, but about 2 a month that I get. So as we were prosecuting these crimes, we noticed a problem. And so we were very happy to see the new law amend the old law. So let's go back to the old Intimidation 1. Frankly, we never charged this. And the problem with this law was this requirement of 2 or more defendants acting together. This old law of intimidation was enacted in, I think it was 1981. And I'm sure the lawmakers meant well, but we just didn't have 2 or more defendants acting together. 100% of our cases that, at least since I've been here, have been committed by single defendant, which means they got to completely avoid being charged with a felony. And that was upsetting to a lot of victims and to community members, where they were saying, this kind of thing, today's age, is only a misdemeanor, or it's not taking this seriously. There was all of those kind of valid criticisms. So this was an issue. The other issue that we came across was something that's actually not here, which is gender. I'm sure you've noticed that gender is missing here. In other words, if you had a misogynist who hates women and he went and beats up a woman just because he hates women, he may be charged with assault 4, but he's not charged with a hate crime. So this was a problem. And then also, we have a lot of transgender victims who get attacked because of their gender identity. And we could not charge any hate crime under Oregon law because there's no gender here. So that was a problem. Now, thankfully, in most of those cases, the defendant would call the victim the F word. Now, we understand that, of course, that's traditionally used for gays and lesbians, a slur against gays and lesbians, and that gay lesbian is separate from transgender. I mean, for some persons that may be the same, but it's not automatically the same. I mean, we all understand that, but the defendant, for whatever reason, usually I'm sure ignorance or whatever it is, would assume that transgendered persons are also gay or lesbian, and would call them the F word. But as you can see, it's really the defendant's perception of victims, one of these things. So that really helped us. So we were able to charge those cases under sexual orientation. But still, it seemed wrong that, and offensive to many people in the community, that gender identity was not included here. So that was the issue with felony. For the misdemeanor, the issue was the same, that there's no requirement of 2 or more defendants. However, the absence of the gender here is pretty obvious. So there's the same problem here as well. So here is the new law. The new law is very similar to the old law. So basically, here is the elements again of Intimidation 1. So what they did was they basically took away this element of 2 or more defendants acting together. So they took that away. The other thing they did was they added gender identity. So that is the 2 changes to the new law. And the new law is now called bias crime 1 or bias crime in the 1st degree. It's a felony. And it's the same statute section as the old section. So this completely replaced the Intimidation 1, which no longer exists, or as 166, 165. Everything else, the language is exactly the same as Intimidation 1. So that's the only 2 difference, is the absence of the 2 or more defendants requirement and adding of gender identity. And gender identity, the new law has defined it as the following. An individual's gender-related identity, appearance, expression, or behavior, regardless of whether the identity, appearance, expression, or behavior differs from that associated with the genders assigned to the individual at birth. So this covered certainly misogynists as well as a transgendered victim as well. So that solved that issue, which is great. So that's that. And then with bias crime 2, same thing. Everything is the same except for adding of gender identity with that same definition. And that definition is found in the statute itself. And this is also taking place of Intimidation 2. It's the same statute section as Intimidation 2. Bias crime in the 2nd degree, which is a misdemeanor. So that's the real difference. Now, there's also been, frankly, lots of disappointment, frankly, even though this is a step in the right direction. There's many people that I've heard in the community who were disappointed that there were not more reforms, that when there are offensive physical contact against one of the protected class victims, that still remains a misdemeanor, for example. That yet at the same time, a threat of placing a victim in fear of serious physical injury, which is of course terrible, but there's no actual physical contact between the victim and the defendant here, and it's a felony. And yet, when there is offensive physical contact, that's only a misdemeanor. So people were disappointed about that, because the offensive contact obviously is not just a punch. It could be a slap. It could be of a sexual nature. It could be spitting, or throwing urine on the victim's face or whatever. And that's, if it doesn't cause physical injury, that's a misdemeanor, which seems, understandably unfair. So I think there are hopes for greater amendment and reform for something like this section to be added to the felony section, and some other things. But anyway, that's the changes between the new and the old law. The one thing I wanted to also go over was this. I'm sure some of you eagle-eyed viewers may have noticed that you have this, which is a threat of serious physical injury. And then you have this, which is threatening serious physical injury. So it's like, well, what's the difference between that threat of the felony and the threat of the misdemeanor? Well, here it is. So let's do a split screen with one side having the felony, one side having the misdemeanor. So if you look at the language of the felony, it's intentionally place a victim in fear of imminent serious physical injury. And from bias crime 2, it's this. intentionally subjects the victim to alarm by threatening A, B, these things. So you can see the difference. First difference is obviously the two subsections here. For the felony, it only applies to the victim directly if the victim was threatened. But here in the misdemeanor, it's actually spread out to both the victim's family member or a threat to cause damage to the victim or victim's family member's property as well. So the misdemeanor is kind of expanded that way. This does not exist here in the felony. And the other big difference is this word, fear. Notice the felony uses the word fear, and the language of Bias Crime 2 uses the word alarm. To a lot of people, this sounds like word games, and this sounds like the same definition. So there's no case law guiding us as far as the difference between this. I'm sure there will be one day. So the way we've been doing it up here in Multnomah County is like this fear it must require greater apprehension of getting hurt versus the misdemeanor. For example, if a defendant has a knife and is swinging the knife without actually making contact with the victim, thank God, and is approaching the victim, almost like an attempt assault 2 situation, we would charge it as a felony, as opposed to if the defendant is not swinging or approaching, but just is brandishing the knife and is showing it in front of the victim and saying, I'm going to cut you, I'm going to kill you, I'm going to, those kind of threats. Well, because the defendant's not swinging and is not approaching kind of stuff, we would then charge that more like the misdemeanor. So that's alarm versus the fear. So alarm, presumably legislature, I'm guessing, meant that there would be a less level of apprehension, but still enough to be a crime. So this is a situation in a felony where we would charge maybe attempt assault 2 and unlawful use of weapon. And maybe with Bias Crime 2, it's a situation where we would not charge attempt assault 2, but just the unlawful use of weapon. So that would be the difference between the two, and that's how we've been doing it. Okay. Yeah, we went over that part. Just some quick things here. Bias crime, this bias crime new statute, it took effect on July 15th of 2019. So it is not retroactive, which means all bias crimes committed before July 15th, 2019 has to be charged under the old intimidation statute. I still have on my caseload several cases where it's charged under the old intimidation statute. And they're still hanging around thanks in large part to the COVID backlog, where I don't know about other counties, but in Multnomah County, we're not really doing trials, so our caseload is just ballooning, and many of them get caught up, some of the old cases under the old intimidation statute. Proving motive. So this is the most important part. I know there's a lot of law enforcement out there, so I really want law enforcement to understand this portion. So there is a difference between intent and motive. This again sounds like lawyer word games, but in the courtroom, this actually really is critical. This is one of those like, hey, if you remember nothing from this presentation, just pay attention to this part, and then you should be good, kind of a thing. So the intent, as we use it in criminal law courtrooms, is what is the defendant trying to do with his or her actions right now? So if the defendant has a knife and is swinging it toward the victim and is approaching and says, I'm going to kill you, the intent there is to cut, stab, seriously injure, or possibly kill the victim, right? That's the intent. What is the defendant trying to do that you can figure out from his or her actions and words? The motive, on the other hand, is why is the defendant doing this? It's what is driving the victim to do this. That's the difference. So the intent is what the defendant is trying to achieve. Motive is why is the defendant doing it. Usually, motive is not an issue and is not an element. And we often argue this, like in murder. We don't have to prove why the defendant did it. We just have to prove that the defendant did it. We just know that the action is immoral and evil enough. There where and it's that the motive doesn't matter, and a lot of times it's almost impossible to prove. We have no idea why. But in these bias crime cases, we got to prove it. So that's why these bias crime or hate crime cases laws around the nation are often almost impossible to prove unless you have like this confessional by the defendant saying, "Oh, I did that because of because I hate African Americans." I mean, they would not use that term, but that kind of a thing. So that's why those kind of crimes are often not charged. However, in Oregon, it's different. The because of requirement is what you need to pay attention to. Remember, here's the elements of the law again. You notice here, the whole thing comes down to these two words, because of. Because let's face it, these are separate crimes by itself. If you take out this second square or rectangle, these are, this is assault 4. I forgot what crime this is. I think this is a subsection of either assault 3 or something else. Anyway, I apologize. I should know that. Or this is menacing. But then when you add this element, that's what makes it the bias crime. And you notice it says because of defendant's perception of victims in the protected class. Same thing exists for the misdemeanor bias crime too, the phrase because of. So then the question becomes, well, what does that phrase mean, because of? Well, most people would think that because of means that the defendant's exclusive or only or primary motive for stabbing this victim or brandishing the knife against this victim or hitting this victim is because of the victim's race or defendant's perception of victim's race or sexual orientation or gender identity or whatever it may be. In other words, that has to be the main motivation, like 99% or even like primary, at least 51%. In other words, if the victim was white and not African American, this defendant would not have hurt this victim. That's in law we would call it, especially in civil law, a but-for test. But for the defendant's perception of victim's race, well, whatever it is, the defendant would not have committed the crime. However, that's what most lawyers or just general public jurors would think. However, that's not true. This is the part that I want people to pay attention to. The whole like, hey, if you pay attention to nothing else, this is it kind of a thing. There's a case called State versus Hendrix. It's an old case from 1991, 813 ORAP 734. This was affirmed by the Oregon Supreme Court, 314 OR 170 in 1992. Now, this specific issue was not affirmed, but basically they didn't really appeal that, and the case itself overall was affirmed. For those lawyers who are watching, if you look this up on for shepherdizing, this may come up as like, oh, there's something afterwards. But if you look up the case law, it's good law, is my point. And what the court said in this case was that basically mixed motive is okay. In other words, because of, what it really means is that it's not a but-for test, but they use the words. So what they said in State versus Hendrix is that if the defendant's perception of defendant's race, national origin, all of that stuff, religion, played, quote, any role, end quote, in the crime, then defendant's guilty of bias crime or intimidation, as it was discussing back then, but it straight transfers to the bias crimes now. In other words, if the defendant was beating up the victim because they got into a road rage thing, and then while and the defendant's white and the victim is African American, and there was a road rage incident, and the defendant is beating up the victim, and maybe says the N-word or like says like I'm gonna beat your black ass, or something like that, makes reference to the victim's race, even though the primary reason for this may be the road rage or because the victim slept with the defendant's wife or something like that. If the defendant's perception of victim's race played any role, then it doesn't matter. So the primary motivation regarding race, if that is not, even if that's 1% of the incident, under Oregon law, the way State Hendrix is interpreting this statute, that person's guilty of bias crime. So that's the important thing, that it could be a mixed motive, that it does not have to be a primary or certainly exclusive motive, and it's not a but-for test. So I've gone over this with much smarter than people than I, and everyone seems to come up with the same conclusion reading this case law, including I've done 3 trials, including jury trials, where we've incorporated this into the jury instructions, and the judges also have agreed and allowed this. So here's a sample. This is under the old intimidation thing, but here is the jury instruction, and you notice here it says because of, because that's from the statute. And like in a PowerPoint, I would put that word, because of. And you don't need to read all of this, but I'm just showing you just in a practical kind of application. So then we would ask for a special instruction, definition of because of. Because the definition is not your standard definition. It's something that State versus Hendrix said. So I put, when using the phrase person intentionally, blah, 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 because of the person's perception of race or color of the other person, because of means the perception of, this is the victim's race or color or national origin, played any role in defendant's commission of the offense. That's the key here, any role. This is from State versus Hendrix, and that's our authority for it. And of course, defense attorney opposes this, and the judges have given it each of the times. So that's the key word there. That's the instruction. So anyway, let me go back. Oh, I'm sorry. So anyway, that's the most important part. And I say this because we did not, when I started prosecuting these, when we had our first trial, we didn't unfortunately know about the State versus Hendrix, and we ended up doing one trial, two trials without asking for this instruction, simply because I'm embarrassed to say we didn't know about this. And there is not a lot of case law regarding these crimes. And with the volume here, and just kind of, that's not an excuse, but just an explanation. In the middle of all this, we did this, and we won the trial as far as the other counts, like assault and those kind of things. But the juror said, well, we don't know if this is a primary motivation. We just don't know. So they came back with a not guilty. After we found this case law and we started giving these instructions, they've come back 100% guilty. So this is a big deal for prosecutors to know, and for law enforcement to know as well. So I know I've gone over the law itself, and if you're anything like me, it's difficult to kind of process this in the abstract. I'm a very application person. I need facts to understand exactly how this applies. So that's what I like to do, and just quickly go over some fact scenarios. So hopefully this makes a little more sense. Just want to say real quick, Oregon bar requirement of talking about cases. Most of these cases have either pled out or they've gone to trial, but there's a few in here that are still pending, and the Oregon bar ethics requirement requirement is that we prosecutors not talk about specific details about the case that's not been made public, or make any kind of impressions or subjective opinions. So I just want to say I acknowledge this, and I'm not doing that with any of these. The only thing that I'll say about some of these cases which are still pending on my docket are facts that are already made public through probable cause affidavit. So it's nothing exclusive. It's all information that's readily available to the public. So there's some legal preamble there. So I've just kind of roughly categorized these. Here are the cases regarding African-American victims, and this is not comprehensive, just a quick sample. And I don't think I'll go over every single one of these, but just real quick. So State versus Michael Amatulo, this is a case where 2 African-American kids, ages 7 and 13, were taking the trash. They were not doing anything risky or committing a crime. They're just taking out the trash at an apartment complex. And this defendant, 60-year-old white guy, starts antagonizing them, calls them the N-word. The 13-year-old gets upset and starts arguing back. Good for him. And defendant goes and gets a kitchen knife, about this big, huge kitchen knife, holds it against the two kids, calls them the N-word so many times, and says that he's gonna slice them up and all of these kind of things. While the defendant, by the way, is standing in front of his apartment doorway. So then the defendant gets the phone and calls 911 and lies, and this is all recorded, lies and says the kids are attacking him. So essentially he is weaponizing the police to sic the police on the two victim kids, presumably just assuming that the presumable white police officer will listen to him because he's white, as opposed to the two African-American kids. But the officer who showed up was white, kind of figured the situation out because the kids ended up, the officer found the kids hiding under the stairwell because they were so scared because they ran away. And then is like, hey, defendant, if you're so scared of these 7 and 13-year-old kids, why don't you just go inside the apartment and close the door? You know, what do you need a knife for? You know, that kind of thing. And so he figured it out and arrested the defendant, and the defendant went on this epic racist tirade where he talked about, where he screamed out like, all the N-words are monkeys and apes. They should go back to the planet of the apes. I mean, it was like, wow, incredibly beyond offensive guy. So that actually went to trial, and we ended up getting the absolute maximum, where he didn't even get any credits. Asked that he be served, that he serve 100% of that, and we gave him consecutive sentences and all of that stuff. So that was a bad one. Matthew Karcher, African-American victim who's a barber who lived in this neighborhood for like 30 years. After a hard day of work, he comes home from a bus stop. He's walking home alone, about a three-block walk, when defendant, white guy, comes up to the victim, and the defendant has a pit bull. And the victim happens to be afraid of pit bulls due to bad experiences. And the defendant calls the victim the N-word and says, "You're in the wrong neighborhood, N-word." And the victim's just like, "What are you talking about? I lived owned the home here for 30 years." And then the defendant tries to sic the pit bull on the victim, who ends up running away. Defendant chases him, continuously calls him the N-word, and the victim had to run inside a plaid pantry, which was like the only thing that was open. So that's Matthew Karcher. State versus Michael Black, ironically named. This guy, Michael Black, white guy, was sitting on his porch, and a 12 or 13-year-old African-American boy with a couple of friends were just walking home after a basketball practice. It was like 7 at night. He was on the victim was on a bicycle. The other two were not, or one was walking a bike. So he would go ahead and kind of make a circle while the friends catch up, and they would keep doing this. And then when the victim was in the drive, what he thought was not a driveway, but what do you call those? A cul-de-sac. Defendant yells out the N-word at the victim and says, "This is private property, get out of here, N-word." And the African-American boy had never been called that, so he was just shocked and said to Michael Black, "Hey, you can't call me that." And then the defendant said, "The hell I can, I'm gonna blow your head off," N-word, and then got up suddenly and rushed into his house. So the kid thought, "Oh crap, he's gonna go get a gun." So he told his friends, one of whom was also African American, and they just got the hell out of there. So that was a trial. Also was found guilty. Chris Edwards. This one was interesting. This defendant, white guy, was he was trespassing on a lawn. I think he was stalking some female victim or something. So the police came and arrested him. He's cuffed now, and there's some additional officers show up for backup. This guy's cuffed, and as he was about to be placed into the back of a squad car, one of the officers that shows up is an African-American officer, Portland police officer. Defendant starts going crazy and says, "Oh, who is that N-word? I'm gonna go get him." And the police are just shocked. I mean, they're like, "With the police, we have guns here. There's multiple of us. You're cuffed." Defendant still tried to like move over and try to rush the African-American officer and call the other officers N-word lovers and all of this stuff, and ended up spitting in the face of one of the female officers who primarily arrested him. So that's Chris Edwards. Jeremy Hallwell, I put these things as like the security guard in parentheses to help me remember, because some of these after a while run all together. A security guard, African-American guy, was asking the defendant, Jeremy Hallwell, homeless guy who was blocking the entrance of one of the businesses. So the victim very nicely said, "Hey, sir, I'm sorry, you can't sleep here. You're blocking the way of this business. You got to move over." And Hallwell started calling him the N-word, moved away, and then ended up charging the victim with the of all things, he had a guitar, and ended up smashing the guitar on the victim while calling him the N-word. So that's Mr. Hallwell. And then Dorian Cannon, the victim was a TriMet bus driver, African-American guy, and the defendant wanted like some crazy like change or something, whatever it was. And when he couldn't get it, because you have to have exact change, you can't like give some big bill, the defendant started getting mad and called the bus driver the N-word, and he kicked the glass portion of the bus door. And so we charged him under that property destruction, the criminal mischief misdemeanor portion of the bias 2. This guy, he actually did that twice to 2 different bus drivers, both African-American. Eric Scardino, he was chasing a African-American guy in a parking lot, both were homeless, with a shovel, calling him the N-word. So the police came, and of course the defendant then saw the police, went right up to the police with the shovel and said, "Arrest that N-word." And the police were like, oh, okay. So they arrested him instead. That's Eric Scardino. Autumn Burns, she was inside a Starbucks where she was trespassed and was harassing customers. And the security guard, female security guard, African-American woman, went up to the defendant and asked very nicely, "I'm sorry, you can't be in here, you're trespassed, you have to leave." That's when Autumn Burns calls her the N-word, punched her in the face, and just attacked her. So that was Autumn Burns. John Rogers, he did this twice. There's 2 cases with him. He went inside a Multnomah County library, and one of the librarian was a female African-American woman, and he was trying to log on to one of the computers, but because he had looked up like pornography before, he's been trespassed and all his privileges have been revoked. He was getting frustrated. He was like pounding and trying to essentially break the computer. And when the victim said, "Hey, sir, you can't do that. You have to leave," he started coming after her. He like trashed the computer and just went after her, called her the N-word, and traumatized her horribly. And he almost, he just went after her. I almost hurt her pretty badly. Burnbeck, this guy went up to a TriMet African-American bus driver, called him the N-word, and spat in his face, which when the spit went into his eyes and ended up giving the victim COVID. So that was pretty horrendous. Thomas DeLong, this guy also chased a 68-year-old TriMet supervisor in a bus station parking lot, calling him the N-word, saying, "I hate all N-words," and chased him around trying to beat him up pretty bad, where the 68-year-old had to hide inside of his own car and had to call the police. So you can kind of see the pattern here of these kind of cases. Then we have ones with Latino victims, Alexander Harrington. Defendant was white guy who was homeless guy blocking like the storefront. He was also blocking it while doing drugs openly with syringes and having sex openly there. So the building manager called the victim, who is like the maintenance person. He was Latino. He went up to defendant and said, "Hey, I'm sorry, you can't be doing this stuff in front of this business because there's a hair salon and many other places there that they were driving customers away, droves." And that's when defendant did not like that, so he took out a knife, put it in the face of the victim, and charged at him and called him some horrendous slurs against Latinos. And this is another issue where I was embarrassed to say that when I heard these slurs, I had no idea what those were. And just as a side note, as a practical application, I don't know, but if that happens with law enforcement, If they hear certain words and they don't know that it's a slur against a certain community, it would go right past them. So that's something that I had to get educated on by a Latino member of our office, and I was very embarrassed and ashamed to not know those words. So that's what this defendant did. Castellano Leatherberry, this happened at a soccer game up here, where after the soccer game, the defendant, who was excuse me, born in Peru, but he was adopted by a white mom, and he and his mom were just walking, and this defendant went up to him and said, "Go back to your country." No, what did he say? Like, said something about like your Hispanic ass, or something about his race, and pulled out a knife against him. So that's that case. Matthew Young, the victim is a Gresham police officer who's Latino. Matthew Young is a DV defendant, and when the officer went to investigate this guy spat on the officer and tried to punch him and called him some of those same Latino slurs. Let's see how many days of time, okay. And then Delisa Gill, this was interesting, she went after, she's African-American woman, the defendant, but she went after a Latino woman victim. The Latino woman victim operated a Mexican restaurant, and defendant came in with her friend, wanted some food for like half the price because she was hungry, and the victim was kind enough to say, okay, you can have this food for half the price. And then there's some dispute over a change or something, and the defendant just started going crazy, started screaming at the victim, called her, among other things, cartel bitch, and called her, and the victim didn't really speak English well, so the defendant was mocking her, yelling at her, saying, "Don't speak Spanish. It's America. You can only speak English here." And the victim's calling 911, and all this is captured on 911. Which was great because this went to trial, and that was very, very useful. And then the defendant ended up saying, like, "Go back to your country, get out of here," and ended up taking the victim's head and took the victim outside and pounded her head against a trunk of a tree and the concrete sidewalk. So that was Delisa Gill. She was found guilty. National origin. I kind of mentioned some of this, but Robert Oden's a case where we had, excuse me, 4 Latino gay men who had just left a gay nightclub, and these guys were just having a good time. They were not being loud. We had nearby like security people who were saying like, no, they were not loud or obnoxious or anything. These young guys were just laughing, walking, and then this guy, Robert Oden, a white guy, he came out from nowhere out of the bushes and said, "Stop speaking Spanish. It's America. You have to speak English." He went after them, even though Robert Oden is an older guy. These guys are in their 20s, and there's 4 of them. Defendant still went after him as his hatred was boiling over, and he ended up punching 3 of them. And these guys, I mean, they could have really hurt the defendant, and maybe should have. But the victim, they're such nice people, they basically were able to like push him off, run back to the club, and have the security people call the police, who ended up arresting this defendant. So, Spanish, don't speak Spanish here, go back to your country. So that's national origin. Jermaine McKenzie. This was interesting where the defendant is from Belize. And once again, embarrassingly, I did not know my geography. I'm like, Belize, what is that? It's a country in Central America on the east side on the Atlantic Ocean coast. He went inside a Jamaican restaurant, and the owner was obviously from Jamaica. And apparently there is a rivalry between these 2 countries where the Belizeans don't like Jamaicans, Jamaicans don't like Belizeans. They both looked African-American, ironically. And this defendant went inside the Jamaican restaurant, started talking all this crap about Jamaicans, and the lady was like, what? Are you serious? You're coming to my restaurant and insulting me like this? He ended up pulling out a knife. Her teenage son was there also and was saying stuff about how awful Jamaicans were. So that's based on national origin, charged it, and he pled guilty. Sierra Mcdonald, this is another person who went after Latino, saying, and she's also African-American female, So she went to a taco truck, like a taco cart, and started calling her all kinds of like effing Mexicans, go back to your country, stop speaking Spanish, and ended up trying to stab her with this wooden stake and destroyed all her food on the cart and all kinds of stuff like that. She had a couple of those cases actually. LGBTQ, gay lesbian victims, Justin Watling. This guy on Pride Parade Day went up to a defendant, called him the F word, and said, "Why is a F word?" Because the victim was walking with with his girlfriend actually, but defendant thought that he was gay and said, "What's a F word? Walking around with a fine woman like this," or something like that. It ended up attacking him, punching him in the face, and all of that stuff. Even though the victim was with his girlfriend and like 4 other people, but that did not stop this defendant. Kamar Livingston, the defendant, he was shoplifting, and then the security guard, the defendant presumed was a gay, and said like, "Hey, what's a F word doing coming after me? Wait a minute, you're an F word. You can't fight. I can kick your ass." And then it's almost like a self-realization. And then he went after the victim and just and took out a machete actually and went after the victim, calling him the F word. Robert Oden, I mean, that obviously also, the defendant not only said like, stop speaking Spanish and go back to your country, he also called him the F word as well. So that case would be here. Don Kirchhoff, 2 guys were sitting outside of a bakery on a bench. They're just talking when Don Kirchhoff came up to him and says, "What are 2 F words doing here? Get the hell out of here." And he ended up attacking both of those guys. Transgender victims, we had Timothy Walsh, where the victim, she identifies as female, and she looks beautiful, and she was walking, and then this defendant comes up to her, wanting to hit on her, thinking she's thinking, I mean, in his mind, thinking she's female, and she is female. I just want to make that clear. But in the defendant's mind, when he comes up close, he says, "Oh, wait a minute, you're just a dude dressed in female's clothes." And they started calling her the F word and punched her in the face and just went after her and beat her up pretty bad. And then Dominic Gonzalez, this was, there was a long line at a homeless shelter where they're getting like supplies and food and whatever it is. And the victim is born male, but he was wearing a dress. He identifies as female. Defendant Dominic Gonzalez went up to him, called him the F word. "What's a F word? Guy wearing a dress," and just punched him in the face and just went after him. Muslim victim, we have these cases where Frederick Sorrells, we had a Muslim couple where the woman was wearing like a hijab over her face. They're in their car and she's pregnant and they're going to the hospital because she's having some issues. And this defendant rides up next to them and starts calling her terrorist and you Muslim, and you can't wear that here, you effing terrorist, it's America, so you can't wear that here. And then he started making gun gestures, which sounds to me silly at first, but for a mile, he tracked the car who tried to get away from him. He kept coming up, and then he kind of reached in after making fake gun things, which made the couple think that he was about to pull out a real gun. So that was Frederick Sorrells. Jasmine Campbell, this was a really strange, bizarre one. Our victim was a, sorry, quite how we're doing on time. Okay, we're doing well. I'm almost done with this. She was a 20-year-old Saudi exchange student, and she's wearing like a hijab again, where just her eyes are showing. This defendant came up to her, tried to take that off of her, like kind of ended up choking her with it and saying, and then ended up pulling it away. And then she ended up mocking it, rubbing the hijab all over her body. And then she took off her clothes, and then she put it between her legs and started kind of flossing with the hijab, desecrating it, and saying that when asked later that she said she wanted to like essentially like rescue the victim from Islam or something like that. So that's one of those cases. So hopefully that gives you some idea of how what these cases are like. Very serious cases. The we found that the entire community, not just the minority community, but the entire community is frankly hurt when they hear this. And they are very, very interested in making sure that these are handled well. A few things, release or hearings of bail. I always mention how these are defendants that are endangering the minority community. That's important for the judge to know. So I think it's important for us prosecutors to mention that at release hearings or when setting bail. We only charge the portions of the protected class that applies. I know this is getting kind of technical, but we don't when we charge, like for example, the one where like Robert Oden, where it was against both national origin, race, and sexual orientation. We would charge 3 counts, and under those 3 counts, we would charge each one of those. Now, they would all merge together, but if we only charged one, at trial, the judge, the way the Oregon law is, would force us to choose which of the protected class are we going on. And it's like, well, it's 3, so why do we have to only choose one? We'd have to elect. So we would charge multiple counts, even though they would merge, and for each count, we will charge portions of the protected class that applies. This is more exactly for the prosecutor, so I won't go over this now. We have to be careful when using any of these slurs. That's why you hear me say like F word or N word, that kind of a thing. During the trial, I do say it when I'm quoting the defendant. I think we kind of have to, unfortunately, but otherwise, we have to be careful with these slurs because they're extremely offensive and hurtful. So we have to have great respect around these slurs when handling these cases. These are some closing argument examples, which I won't go over now. Sentencing for these cases is really important. We try to get, this is one thing we prosecutors need to improve on, which is we focus almost everything on the trial, but we need to focus a lot more energy on the sentencing as well. Often like bring in community members. We brought in, like in that one case with the 2 kids and a knife, I brought in a professor of chair of Black Studies from PSU, Portland State University, talk about the history of the N-word and what kind of effects that has, being called the N-word when for a child, that kind of stuff. For the one with the Mexican restaurant owner, we brought in people from the Latino community groups to help support the victim, and she was really, really thrilled that she didn't think she mattered, and she really felt like she mattered with the way we handle these cases. And also just technically, it's an unranked crime. You know, we do these, these chart things. Right now, the Criminal Justice Commission has not yet gone through all the hearings and public hearings. So it's an unranked crime, which means we could argue for anything. We could technically argue it's a 11. The defense can argue that it's a 1. You know, we usually go around 6 or 7, which is the rank of the minor person felony. But anyway. There are federal prosecution options, which I won't go over all of this now, but there are these things. And I know that the U.S. Attorney's Office in the last several years have been very, very interested in doing this, but I just will skip this because it'll take too long to go over in the interest of time. And then voir dire, this is really important. This is, again, more for lawyers, but the jury selection process, we have to talk about all kinds of these kind of issues very openly. So anyway, in terms of just quick practical application, this is just me and my contact information. That's my direct desk number, so feel free to call me or email me. It may take a little while, but I'm happy to get back to you, even if I don't know you, and say, hey, you know, I attended your whatever, and have these questions or whatever it is. I'm happy to answer, and I'll always get back to you. Just may not be quick, but definitely will. That's just some other practical considerations for law enforcement. I know that one of the things that we've dealt with is like, I know this seems silly, but it almost seems like, hey, if you don't put it in a report, it's almost like it didn't exist in court, which obviously is not true in real life, but it does hurt us when something's not in a report. So when we started going over some of this stuff with some of the law enforcement, a lot of them have said, well, gee, I didn't know about these elements. We hear defendants say all kinds of slurs all the time. And if I would have known about this, I would have written that down in the reports. And my thing is, then write them down, please. You know, please write them down. and it doesn't matter if the defendant has been disrespectful to the law enforcement officer and calling the an African-American officer the N-word, or like that one case, the Latino officer, those awful slurs, write it down. It's very, very important. And you may have a bias crime whether you know it or not. So that's important to document those kind of things. And also kind of knowing some of these slurs, which I didn't know, certainly would help too. Otherwise, the officer wouldn't know to write it down. And I know that, I believe that in the last few years, we've gotten much better at, hopefully, these communities of color and marginalized communities, the vulnerable communities, trusting the police more and more to report these things, letting them know that the law enforcement absolutely cares and wants to hear from these victims, and that many of them are really surprised pleasantly when we're going forward on this kind of stuff. On behalf of them, many have said how, this kind of stuff's been happening for years. It's the first time I'm here at grand jury kind of thing. So the other thing real quick, we hear grand jury all of these cases, even if it's pure misdemeanor charges, because these are so serious. And first of all, give misdemeanors to senior attorneys like us, because we don't want some of the newer misdemeanor attorneys handling this kind of stuff. And we end up grand jurying all of this because even though officers do their best, sometimes the victims are rattled, so they don't always comprehensively say everything. So in grand jury settings, when they say everything, sometimes we're like, oh, we have these additional crimes, and we don't want to find that out the morning of trial the night before. So well before, even though it's all misdemeanors, you can indict on misdemeanors. We find that kind of stuff out. And there are many times where we're like, wait a minute, this is not a bias crime. I mean, it's an assault or whatever it is, but it's not a bias crime for XYZ reasons. And if that's the case, obviously we don't want to charge it. So these are very, very serious. So it's good to kind of filter all this out and have that testimony solidly at the grand jury level. So we grand jury all of these cases, whether it's felonies or misdemeanors, which has been really, really helpful. And it also gives the case and the victims that respect of taking these cases seriously and having all the details, but both for us and for the defense attorney. Here's the transcript, here's the recording, you can listen to it, there you go. And they're like, okay, I think maybe we'll think about a plea or whatever it is. So anyway, those are some quick practical considerations. I know that's a lot of stuff, and we are 2 minutes over an hour. I think I was just supposed to be for an hour, so that is all. Anyone has any questions or anything?
BJ, thank you so much. We'll open it up to questions here and see if folks do have further questions about it. I also just want to mention that Johanna Costa has joined us. She was last month's presenter who was mentioning victim support services around this and how we can kind of educate our community. So if you have questions for Johanna as well, please, I think we have the opportunity for a bit of a forum today. Beth.
Thanks, BJ, for the presentation. That was really good. It does seem like almost every one of your examples, came from the defendant themselves, basically saying at the moment all of these slurs and statements and stuff. Have you done any cases where that wasn't the situation, but maybe you had other facts to show that would be their motive? I don't know, they had some other history of that or something like that, or have most of the cases really have the person saying all of those things, and that's what makes it be the bias crime?
Yeah, pretty much 100% of our cases have been a defendant saying some kind of a slur. We had one where they were saying oh, this defendant treats these Latino victims differently than everyone else, kind of stuff. And it's like, okay, well, that may be, but how do you really show that? So yeah, it's pretty much been all slurs by the defendant, him or herself. Now, the statute does not require a slur, but it does say because of the defendant's perception of the victim's race or whatever. And it just, the most practical way that's come out has been exactly that. Yeah. So
BJ, this is Benjamin Lowell. I'm with DA and Beth's down here in Jackson County. Do you foresee situations where you could foresee if they had a social media presence that espoused racial hatred, and then they attacked someone of that race, that you could graft that onto this, even if they don't use the word during that attack?
That's possible, but that brings up a great point, which I forgot to mention during the presentation. This is really important too. The way these laws are made, they attach to the incident, right? This is really important. The crime is not, aggravated racism, right? We're not judging a person's heart here. So it's really like a menacing plus, because of defendant's perception of victims, whatever. It's a crime mischief plus or harassment plus, that kind of stuff. I mean, it's literally that crime plus the bias motive portion. So the crime is the bias crimes attaches to the incident. That's why when and by that, what I mean is, we all understand that a racist can act non-racist for an incident or a lot of times. Just because someone's racist, it doesn't necessarily mean every single thing that he or she does has a race bias, racist motive, right? I mean, if they go and they're nice to the African-American store clerk and gives change or whatever, you see what I mean? So that's really hard to prove, especially beyond a reasonable doubt, in a court of law. Just like a non-racist can act racist for one incident. Just because they're racist for one incident doesn't necessarily mean that they're a racist for life and that everything they do must have a racist motive, right? That doesn't make any sense, and that wouldn't hold up in court. So we're not judging a person's heart. The charge is not racism. That's why a lot of defendants, when they say, I'm not a racist or I'm not homophobic or whatever, of course, I don't have an opportunity to really respond back this way, but I kind of do, where I say, it doesn't matter. We're not charging you with racism. Being a racist is not a crime in this country. It's a free country. You can be racist. Now, it's offensive and immoral, so you shouldn't be, but that's not what's criminalized here. In other words, the N-word is not criminalized in these crimes. Defense attorneys have brought that up about First Amendment and all this kind of stuff, and it's like, no, that's not what this is. And that's why some people misunderstand this law. This is not a totalitarian law, right? We're not in North Korea. We don't have thought crimes here. That's not what this is. But when people commit actual crimes like an assault or menacing or harassment, and they bring in race or gender identity or whatever it is, Oregon law has said, well, that makes that menacing crime or assault for crime a little bit worse. It's kind of a more serious crime. That's really what this law is. So, yeah, I guess you can do that, but if you don't have like a slur set at the actual crime, then it's like the defense attorney will bring up that point, which is like, okay, maybe he had racist posts dated a week before, but how do you know that was the reason? See what I mean? That kind of a thing. So it would be tough, I would think, if not really not possible. So I'm not saying like you have to have a slur, but practically that's just how it's turned out so far. And maybe there'll be a fact scenario, Beth, like you had asked, where we would have something like that besides a slur. I just don't know what it is so far.
This is Lorenzo Mejia, and I just have a question on unranked offenses. You say these are unranked felonies, crime seriousness?
Yes.
Okay, so I wonder if you're getting different results from different judges, or if you're kind of locked into something after you get something from a certain judge in the jurisdiction, Multnomah County.
No, not really. UUWs, assault and public safety officers, these are what's considered kind of the more minor person felonies, C felonies, and those are ranked 6s. And then the more like serious ones are ranked like 8 and higher. So a lot of people think, depending on the injury kind of a thing, that this would be like a 6. Maybe it shouldn't be counted as just another minor person crime because of the horrible nature of these crimes. So maybe it should be a 7, maybe it should be an 8. We've been kind of in that range. Of course, defense argues for like, 1 or 2 or 3 or something like that. but so it's been mostly done by pleas, and that's been kind of the consistent thing. So we haven't really had a lot of felony bias crime contested sentencings after a trial. So that's my answer that I'm kind of getting to. We haven't really had that kind of long trends because a lot of them will plea, but during the plea, I've been doing, not just me, but our office has been kind of doing that 6, 7, 8s, and so that for whatever that's worth, that's been the kind of the unofficial range that we've been working with.
Well, under the old statute, it seemed like the 2 people assaulting somebody, that would be an assault 3. Were they ranked the same? Because that's what was there really something added, something that made it a more serious crime under the old statute is what I'm getting at.
No, I don't know what the old statute was ranked actually. Assault 3 is obviously a 6, I believe.
Okay.
Yeah, so I don't know, maybe because times have changed and society's taking this more seriously, we're kind of doing it at a 7 or something, but yeah, it's that 6, 7 range is what how we've been treating it mostly.
Thanks.
So real quick update, both Danny Jordan and Commissioner Dodwer got pulled into session a lot longer than they thought, so they'll be excused and we'll get them next month. But BJ and Johanna, thank you so much for being willing to come and speak to our group. I guess the piece that I would just have a question about is in terms of our overall system and community, it seems like there's a need for specified victim supports, a prosecution that's really adept at this type of work, a law enforcement that understands what to look for on the front end, and then a community that's educated about what is reportable and to that degree, maybe groups that were historically reluctant to call law enforcement. Are there efforts or endeavors that you guys are aware of within different communities on each of these fronts to try and make a difference and make this a more prosecutable crime?
Yes, so our new district attorney, Mike Schmidt, has made this one of his priorities, and he's there's a few things happening in Portland in the last several months and the last last year, or a little less than a year. So he's been dealing with those kind of things. But yeah, he's talked to us about, and to me about, and I know that he's reaching out to community groups and to letting them know that we're doing this and what the, not like what the elements are, but to let them know that, hey, there's a lot of stuff that you guys have maybe not reported in the past, that you may not think is a crime, but maybe a crime. So, and getting the police and sheriffs all kind of involved, and they can kind of help go out to the community and talk to them and see if there's issues. And that seems to have worked because I think the reporting has increased somewhat. I don't have exact figures, but just anecdotally, that's what it seems like. And a lot more of the minority communities seem they feel more like safe in reporting it, I guess. So yeah, I think if you can do efforts on those fronts, that it would be very productive. Yeah.
I have a question, Eric.
Yeah, Hilda.
Thank you for that very thorough presentation. When you were talking about the transgender stories and that you shared with us, I noticed the the difficulty with the personal pronouns as to what to use in a transgender person. And we talked a little bit about the gender identity and how that is recognized independent from sex assigned at birth. And I was curious if there is already a rule or an agreement or a decision as to what gets used during the proceedings, if it is the sex assigned at birth or the gender identity that the person claims.
Yeah, we asked the victim how he, she, they identify at the very beginning, and we respect that pronoun all throughout. And a lot of times the judges and even defense attorneys will ask, like, what pronoun should we use? And then we tell them this is what the victim prefers or identifies as. And that's another component where we have, we're a bigger office, obviously, and so we have more victim advocates, including members from LGBTQ community, Latino community, African American community, and I've noticed that it just, no matter how nice or professional or whatever I may be, the temperature in the room seems to change when like some of our LGBTQ advocates walk in, or they're able to speak Spanish, and they can kind of see that, and they just, the whole demeanor changes. Or when our like Chanel, when who's African American, she comes in, and so it just, you kind of see the shoulders kind of lowered, and along those kind of initial conversations, they always ask about the pronouns and how they identify, and how they'd like to be referred, and all of those things. So we definitely do that.
And is it like established, say during a trial, so that one side or the other doesn't use the other pronoun that the victim has, rejected? Or is it up to each person to respect that?
Oh, I see what you mean. Yeah, I mean, we certainly do. I can't tell the defense attorneys what to do.
Right.
And sometimes they ask, sometimes they don't. So it should be the defense attorney, her or himself, should take upon her or himself to do that, or themselves, and the judge too. And in Multnomah County, in all the courtrooms, there are signs on the bench that says, "Please let us know how you like to be referred as, or how you identify."
Yeah.
So that kind of environment is pretty prevalent here. But no, there's not like a requirement where everybody has to call the victim
By the pronoun that they use.
Right.
Mhm.
Yeah.
Great. Thank you so much. I appreciate that.
Sure.
I do want to note that Faye Stetz Waters has noted that the city of Eugene has specialized officers who respond to bias incidents. And Faye is the director of civil rights for the Department of Justice. And we're lucky enough to have her join us today for this presentation. And she has offered down the road, as we get some other topics, to come in and address this group, which we will hold her to even after the convenience of Zoom is gone. I always like having our Salem partners come down to Medford sometimes. So we'll see about extending that invitation pretty soon. Other questions or comments for BJ or Johanna? All right, well, I just thank you both. It was extremely informative. Thank you again, Beth Heckert, for throwing this on our agenda, for saying, hey, how about we look at this, and then finding out that there were these amazing state resources that we were able to invite to our community. Very grateful to both of you. And we will conclude our meeting and look to meet next month. So thank you all so much.